Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to start by giving you the run of show today for the release of the State Department's annual country reports on human rights practices. The Secretary will open it up with some opening comments, then take a couple of questions. He will be followed by Ambassador Robert Gilchrist, the senior official in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, who will give additional comments and then stay to take your questions about the report, and then I will follow up with any additional questions you have about the rest of the world. With that, turn it over to the Secretary.
Thanks, Matt. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I am pleased to be here to launch the 2023 Human Rights Report. At the end of last year, we marked the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, affirming the fundamental idea that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Those words, 75 years ago, enshrined a wide range of universal rights: civil and political, economic, social, cultural. The right to express ourselves freely, to choose our leaders, to worship as we wish, the right to education, to just labor conditions. Standing up for freedom and human rights is simply the right thing to do. But defending and promoting these inalienable and universal rights is also profoundly in our national interest. Countries that respect human rights are more likely to be peaceful, prosperous, stable. The report that we're putting out today presents a factual, systematic account of human rights records across nearly 200 countries and territories. Each one is held to the same standard: developed and developing countries, competitors, as well as allies and partners. While the report focuses on human rights challenges abroad, we recognize that the United States faces its own shortcomings. The strength of democracies like ours is that we address those shortcomings, those imperfections, openly, without sweeping them under the rug. The report illustrates that there is much work to be done to uphold the rights set out in the Universal Declaration. We once again see human rights and the rule of law under stress in more ways and in more places across the globe. Governments continue to lock up citizens who challenge those in power and call for a better future, from Belarus to Venezuela. Many are young. Of the roughly 1,000 political prisoners in Cuba, the average age is just 32. Tragically, as we saw with Alexei Navalny's unjust imprisonment in Russian penal colony, incarceration can come with horrific conditions, with abuse, even death. Governments like Russia also arbitrarily detain foreign nationals for political purposes, using human beings as bargaining chips. Paul Whelan, Evan Gershkovich, and every unjustly held individual deserves to go free. The United States and our many partners will keep working every day to reunite them with their families and to hold accountable governments that engage in this deplorable practice. At the same time, the report shows that governments are extending their abuses beyond their own borders. Nicaragua, attempting to pressure and punish exiled activists by seizing their access. Tajikistan, working with other countries to forcibly return human rights defenders, lawyers, and journalists who fled abroad. The report documents atrocities reminiscent of humanity's darkest moments. In Sudan, both the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces have committed war crimes. Rohingya in Burma, Uyghurs in Xinjiang, each victims of genocide and crimes against humanity. The United States will continue to raise our deep concerns directly with the governments responsible. This year's report also captures human rights abuses against members of vulnerable communities. In Afghanistan, the Taliban have limited work opportunities for women, shuttered institutions found educating girls, and increasing floggings for women and men accused of, quote, immoral behavior, end quote. Uganda passed a draconian and discriminatory Anti-Homosexuality Act, threatening LGBTQI+ individuals with life imprisonment, even death, simply for being with the person they loved. Across countries and regions, authorities are increasingly using technology to intimidate, to censor, to surveil. Governments are deploying artificial intelligence to spread disinformation and even tracking people based on their DNA. They're cutting off and throttling internet access, as Iran did to suppress protests sparked by the death of Mahsa Zina Amini. The Assad regime and others abusing commercial spyware to target journalists and activists. The United States is also actively working to ensure that emerging technologies are used to bolster rights, not undermine them, to make sure that technology is used to advance equal opportunity, not to discriminate against people. Just to cite one example, we've mobilized a coalition of like-minded governments to counter the proliferation and misuse of commercial spyware. Today, as part of our government-wide effort, we're imposing visa restrictions on more than a dozen individuals who contributed to human rights abuses by helping to develop and sell these tools. Hamas's horrific attacks on Israel on October 7th last year, and the devastating loss of civilian life in Gaza as Israel exercises its right to ensure that those attacks never happen again, have also raised deeply troubling human rights concerns. We continue to work every day to bring the fighting to an end, to secure the release of hostages held by Hamas and other groups, to uphold international humanitarian law, to prevent further suffering, to create a path toward a more peaceful and secure future for Israelis and Palestinians alike. These are just a few illustrations from the many countries covered in this report. And the report itself is just one of numerous ways that the United States is working to promote respect for rights and the dignity of all people. We also leverage bipartisan legislation, like the Global Magnitsky Act, and tools like the Khashoggi ban to hold to account those who perpetrate or profit from human rights abuses. Thanks in part to efforts like these, especially by advocates and citizens who are on the front lines, 2023 also saw some encouraging developments. Despite the proliferation of anti-LGBTQI+ laws in some parts of the world, countries from Estonia to Japan to Mauritius made important strides in advancing the rights of LGBTQI+ individuals. Even as labor activists have been targeted, locked up, and killed, unions from South Africa to Mexico to Brazil improved working conditions and advanced workers organizing themselves, key objectives of the Global Labor Directive that President Biden issued last November. Jordan took steps to ensure that children with disabilities could attend school and receive the support that they need. These bright spots are an important reminder that progress on human rights is indeed possible, as long as committed individuals in every part of the globe continue to work to uphold fundamental dignity for all people. On that note, let me just close by thanking a remarkably dedicated team across this department, here in this building, at our posts around the world, who have spent months painstakingly compiling this report. I also want to recognize everyone who helped document the incidents that make up this important resource. Journalists, human rights defenders, citizens, often at great personal risk. Because of each of you, we have a clearer picture of human rights conditions as they are, as well as a renewed determination to strengthen them for the future. So with that, let me take a few questions, and then I'll turn it back over to Bob and to Matt.
Hello, Mr. Secretary. I have two questions. One is about the report, but let me quickly go to your phone calls last night. You've had two important phone calls with Israel's Benny Gantz and Yoav Gallant, who both strongly objected to upcoming punitive action from U.S. on specific Israeli military unit over human rights allegations. Have those phone calls changed your mind? When will you announce the action? And then coming back to the report again, in this report, you have a sentence saying Israelis operating in Gaza took no publicly visible steps to identify and punish officials accused of committing rights abuses. The accusations about IDF's military conduct in Gaza have piled up. They include using food as a weapon, targeting civilian infrastructure, indiscriminate bombing, something even the president has said is taking place. So I'm wondering, we know you've got ongoing processes about this, but could you tell us why is it taking so long to make a definitive assessment about these? And the fact that it's taking so long leads a lot of people suggesting that U.S. has a double standard when it comes to applying the law with Israel. Does the U.S. have a double standard? Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Amira. Let me start with the last part of the question. Do we have a double standard? The answer is no. As this report makes clear, in general, as we're looking at human rights and the condition of human rights around the world, we apply the same standard to everyone. And that doesn't change whether the country in question is an adversary, a competitor, a friend, or an ally. And that's hugely important. With regard to the Leahy Law report that I think you were referring to at the outset, this is, I think, a good example of a process that is very deliberate, that seeks to get the facts, to get all the information, that has to be done carefully, and that's exactly how we proceeded, as we proceed with any country that is the recipient of military assistance from the United States. And again, the same standard applies. I don't have more to say about it today, but I think you'll see in the days ahead that we will have more to say, so please stay tuned on that. On Gaza itself, a few things. First, from day one, we've been working to do everything we can to try to increase protection for civilians, as well as, you know, to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian assistance for the Gazans who so desperately need it. When it comes to allegations of incidents of whether it's violations of international humanitarian law, rights abuses, you name it, we have processes within the department that are looking at incidents that have been raised. Those processes are ongoing, and here again, it's important that we take the time to do our best to get the facts, to get the information, to do the analysis. It's very challenging to do this in real time, and most of, as you'll see, if you look back at other places where we've made determinations ourselves, usually it takes time to do that, to get the information.
Can you at least provide a timeline for any
So
of
I'm
them?
not going to give you a timeline except to say that these efforts are ongoing, and when we feel that we've made that we have the facts, we've been able to do the analysis, we'll make known the findings. Similarly, though, when we see reports of incidents, we also take these directly to, in this case, the Israeli government, and ask for an explanation, information about what did or didn't happen. That too is an ongoing process, and it's, I think, very important to make sure that countries know that we're watching this very, very carefully. But as I say, on the Leahy piece of this, more to come in the coming days.
Thank you for doing this, Secretary. I have a question on the report as well with regard to what it says about Gaza. And it says that war crimes have been committed by Israel and Hamas. And I wonder if this building is actually looking into those allegations to determine their validity, like you guys looked into allegations of war crimes in Ukraine. And if there isn't an assessment happening in this building, who the U.S. government is relying on for that assessment to be made.
Yeah, so Kylie, as I said, we are looking into reports, incidents that are brought to our attention, and we have a process to do that, particularly if there are questions about whether U.S. arms have been involved, and that is ongoing, and we're continue to be focused on that. Every situation, every country is different. For example, the case of Ukraine, where we have made certain determinations. Totally different situation than in Gaza. The Ukrainians, first of all, themselves were not in any way a legitimate target, the way, of course, Hamas is in Gaza. They were also not embedding themselves with civilians, hiding in and under apartment buildings, mosques, hospitals, you name it. And in addition, in the case of Ukraine, when Russian forces, for example, withdrew from Bucha, we were able to see, the world was able to see very plainly what had happened, and we were able to get the evidence. So each of these situations is different, and we have to do our best to collect the facts and follow the facts, and that's what we're doing.
So ultimately, just to be clear, this building will make its own determination if war crimes are being committed by Israel or Hamas or any of those other groups.
We make our own determinations, and of course there may be other bodies that do the same, but we make our own determinations. But importantly, in the case of Israel, Israel has and has demonstrated the capacity also to look at itself. And again, this is what separates democracies from other countries. The ability, the willingness, the determination to look themselves. It's my understanding that they have many open investigations based on reports that have come forward with allegations about abuses of human rights or abuse of international humanitarian law, laws of war, etc. So in the first instance, I think that's the most important thing, that any of our democracies have to make sure that we're policing ourselves, holding ourselves to the standards that we're asking of others. I believe Israel's in the process of doing that based on knowledge of open investigations that they have. And as I said, when incidents are brought to our attention, we look at them, and particularly if there's a possibility that U.S. arms were used in those incidents. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Mr. Secretary, does the Geneva Convention apply to Gaza? Reporters have been asking this for months and not gotten an answer.
Good afternoon to you all, and I express my thanks to Secretary Blinken and to spokesperson Matt Miller for the great remarks and for the introduction. My name is Robert Gilchrist, Ambassador Robert Gilchrist, and I am the Senior Bureau Official in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. I'm honored to be here with you all today to release the 48th Annual Country Report on Human Rights Practices, which was submitted to Congress earlier today. This congressionally mandated report, colloquially known as the Human Rights Report, has been a flagship effort of the DRL Bureau since 1977. It is completed only through the significant expertise and effort brought by the State Department's dedicated public servants in U.S. missions abroad and in Washington, for which I and the Department of State are grateful. Human rights belong to everyone, and this report is one way we demonstrate our commitment to these universal rights. Even though our human rights are universal, they are far from universally respected. And the United States recognizes that standing up for these rights is often dangerous. Human rights defenders and civil society leaders around the world often work at great personal risk to improve the lives of all. That is especially the case for those whose work includes protecting women and girls, members of racial, ethnic, and religious minority groups, LGBTQI+, and persons with disabilities. Members of these groups and those who press for the protection of human rights are often targeted with threats and harassment, arrest, and violence. The brave individuals across the globe who risk their own life and freedom to champion the human rights and dignity of others deserve our deep thanks. In the nearly 50 years since the United States first rolled out the Human Rights Report, we have seen significant changes in respect for human rights around the world. There have been tragedies, but also triumphs. There have been times when U.S. leadership on human rights has been heralded, and times when it has been questioned. But as we look to the future, just a few months after the 75th anniversary of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, one thing is clear. U.S. global leadership in defense and support of human rights is as necessary as ever. This is not a responsibility we take lightly or for granted. We know leadership is earned. The report, unparalleled by any government in its comprehensive approach to human rights worldwide, is one of the tools towards that end. The Human Rights Report does not seek to catalog every human rights abuse or violation throughout the year, nor does it reach legal conclusions. What it does uniquely is present for each country a credible, carefully vetted report that provides the world with a clear window into the human rights conditions in every corner of the globe. This objective reporting is more essential than ever in a world where we increasingly see facts smeared as lies, lies presented as facts, and information manipulated to disturbing ends by autocrats and other malign actors. By shining a light on the human rights conditions of our adversaries and our partners equally, and by lifting up the selfless efforts of human rights defenders and civil society groups working to improve respect for those rights, the United States is helping contribute to a world where those rights are better protected for everyone. Although the report documents human rights conditions in countries around the world, the Biden-Harris administration has made clear that human rights must be safeguarded at home as well. The administration has emphasized since taking office in 2021, the U.S. credibility and standing on human rights internationally depend on how well we are living up to our own obligations and commitments to advance human rights domestically. So we speak of the need to protect and respect human rights for everyone. And when we say that, we mean everyone. At the conclusion of this briefing, the State Department's website will have the 2023 Human Rights Report available for the public. I very much appreciate your attendance today, and I'm happy also to take a few questions.
Hello, Gitarian from Voice of America. I have a question on Iran. The Islamic Republic of Iran has cracked down on women's compulsory hijab since late March, and as of the day it attacked Israel, it has even intensified that crackdown. At the same time, there's legislation on Capitol Hill mandating that the administration sanction higher leadership officials, the Supreme Leader, the President. Now, with this report, this report is about last year, 2023, and this year I'm sure there's a lot more you may have. Mm-hmm. Isn't it not time to sanction the higher officials? And would you be able, should the legislation pass and become an act, it requires, it's the first report within 90 days. Would you be able to fulfill that?
I guess there are a few things to respond in my response. First of all, with regard to any legislation, of course, the department remains committed to fully implementing every law that is passed by Congress. And so there's certainly a commitment by the department to fulfilling the law. As you pointed out, this report refers to 2023. However, in 2023, Iran's dismal human rights record continued to deteriorate. The regime increasingly targeted members of religious and ethnic minority groups, human rights lawyers, journalists, and civil society activists. And as you pointed out, the situation with regard to women continued to deteriorate as well. Iranian women faced increased discrimination through expanded application of punishments against people who violate the mandatory dress code, as you pointed out, leading to protests and widespread acts of civil disobedience. And many women and human rights activists received additional prison sentences for their activism, and they remain behind bars. The authorities continue to detain, sentence, and execute people in an effort to suppress the peaceful protests that began after the Mahsa Zina Amini's September 22 death, while in custody of the morality police. So the United States also continues to work in multinational arena. With regard to sanctions, we have applied sanctions. With regard to any future sanctions, I can't provide, I'm not going to speculate about what may happen in the future, but the department has already actively used visa restrictions and economic sanctions to promote accountability for Iranian authorities' human rights violations since the most recent crackdown following the 2022 riots.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir. The last three reports have shown steadily declining human rights conditions for the Palestinians in Gaza, the West Bank, and in East Jerusalem. I want to, on all aspects, I want to ask you about one aspect, which is administrative detention. The Israelis have put in practice since 1967 something called administrative detention, where they arrest people without charges. They keep them in prison for months, years, sometimes decades, without ever charging them, including children. I want to ask you, is that a violation of international human rights in your view?
Well, I'll refer you to the Human Rights Report in terms of what we say on that specific issue. With regard to Israel, again, we have been clear with Israel on the moral obligations and strategic imperative it has to protect civilians and the human rights of civilians. And in addition, we've been firm in stating that Israel must abide by international humanitarian law, investigate allegations of wrongdoing, including wrongful detentions, and ensure accountability, and that remains a U.S. commitment.
So is it in the view of the United States that administrative detention practiced by Israel, a violation of international human rights?
I said with regard to the Human Rights Reports, the Human Rights Reports do not trigger any sanctions, do not provide any analysis, but rather provide an assessment of the facts on the ground as they are reported to our embassy.
Thank you.
Missy Ryan.
Missy Ryan from the Washington Post. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the assessment regarding Israel's response to alleged human rights abuses by members of the government or the security forces. In the 2022 report, it says that the Israeli military and civilian justice systems have rarely found members of the security forces to have committed abuses, and then says that some steps were taken. In the 23 report, it just says that some credible steps were taken to identify and punish. Is the U.S. assessment no longer that Israel rarely takes action against the security forces? Could you somehow
I think
provide-
regarding that specific language, I don't have details with regard to that, but we can certainly get back to you with that.
Could you give us some sort of assessment of the to what extent some steps were taken? To what extent were those steps taken? Was it occasionally? Do you feel like how far did it go to what you feel like would be an adequate standard? If you could
I think
provide
in the
any context
framework of
there.
the reports, we don't provide sort of a qualitative assessment of a particular situation or how things have evolved regarding that language. I can see if we have additional details, I can provide you with it. I can say that, as I just said, that we raise these issues with the Israeli government continuously, including at the highest levels, with the firm belief that Israel has a moral obligation and an imperative to protect civilians and the rights of individuals in Israel and the occupied territories. But I don't have any further specifics with regard to that language.
Thank you, sir. On China, regarding the Chinese government labor exploitation of North Korean defectors and their repatriation to North Korea, have you discussed this matter with China, and what measures is the United States currently taking on this?
As has been announced, the Secretary will soon be traveling to the PRC this week. And he will, as he does in all of his engagements with the PRC, raise human rights at the highest levels and in the clearest way. And that means with regard to the full array of concerns that we have with the PRC. And we'll go into details with regard to specific conversations, but of course this is an issue that remains of concern and is one that we raise with our Chinese counterparts.
Thank you.
Just one thing on the numbers that you've used. In this report, you have more than 21,000 Palestinians. That's obviously, I understand you had a cutoff at the end of the year, 2023. What are those? What is the source for that number?
Our embassy and the U.S. government use diverse sources. With regard to that specific source, that's something we can get back to you. But we rely on a range of sources for the information that we're able to pull together for the human rights
within
report.
those range of sources, do you use Gaza's health ministry?
With regard to that specific number, I would say that we use a broad range of sources, including from local authorities as well as from international organizations and NGOs.
So it does include Gaza's health ministry?
I'm not saying that specifically. I'm providing you a
local
broader
authority,
answer.
so-
But I'm providing a broader assessment in terms of where the numbers come from for our human rights reports.
Thank you, Matt. On Bangladesh, thank you for doing this. Given the significant human rights abuse highlighted in your reports, including arbitrary killings, torture, and political imprisonment, particularly with reference to the case of former Prime Minister and leader of the opposition, as you mentioned, there is a political ploy to remove her from the political process. So how do you ensure these reports lead to tangible changes and that the regime responsible face consequences for their extreme human rights violations?
Well,
and one more in the end.
I think ensuring anything will happen can be challenging. Certainly our hope with the human rights report is by shining the light on specific issues and specific human rights concerns, we're able to help facilitate change by governments and regimes in a positive direction. With regard to Bangladesh, we had the visa restriction policy that was announced in May 2023, implemented before the elections with the hope of reducing violence to deter actions that could undermine the democratic election process. We have nothing new to announce at this time. But as our longstanding practice, we don't often preview actions with regard to policy or with regard to visas. But we have repeatedly expressed concern about the efforts by the government to repress freedom of expression, including for members of the press, freedom of association, and other fundamental freedoms and human rights, and that remains a continued concern of the United States.
So one more on India, your reports finding significant human rights issues, including credible reports of arbitrary unlawful killings, including extrajudicial killings, and the attack of the press. And you mentioned that the government took minimal credible steps or action to identify and punish officials who who have committed human rights abuses. I'm quoting from your report. So what action you are taking to make the government accountable, as India is your very strategic partner of the United States?
Well, what I will say is the U.S. and India regularly consult at the highest levels on democracy and human rights issues. We strongly urge India to uphold its human rights obligations and commitments. We also regularly meet with civil society representatives both in the U.S. and India to hear their perspectives, and those sorts of perspectives inform the Human Rights Report. And we encourage the government of India to consult and meet regularly with civil society organizations representing a diversity of people. So there are a number of steps. It remains a key component of not just our dialogue, but in terms of our engagement with India.
Nadia?
I just have a technical question, actually. When you said you have multiple sources of gathering information, do you rely on Palestinian and Israeli human rights organizations, especially B'Tselem? And does the embassy in Jerusalem have some kind of a final say on it? Do they omit information? Do they block certain information? Or is the State Department basically the one who makes the final decision?
I would say, our embassy in Jerusalem is part of the State Department. Certainly the reports are pulled together in the field with information that's compiled from our embassy, but also in Washington. And in the end, what this represents is the voice of the entire State Department. And it comes from we pull from a multitude of sources, including from within government and outside of government.
Alex.
Thanks so much. Move to South Caucasus. I have two questions. One is on Georgia. The report reflects last year Georgian government's failed attempt to push foreign agent law. Can you please put that in the context, given the current events going on in the country? Why was it wrong back then, in your opinion, and why is it wrong right now? And second, on Azerbaijan, the secretary last year spoke with President Aliyev, and he raised human rights concerns in the country multiple times. But yet we see the report reflects 254 political prisoners in the country. Is it a reflection of the fact that you guys don't have enough tools, to move the needle?
Well, with regard to the foreign agents law in Georgia, the U.S. remains deeply concerned that if enacted, this draft legislation would harm civil society and civil society organizations that are working to improve the lives of Georgian citizens. And we derail Georgia from its European path. We are equally concerned this draft legislation would impede independent media organizations working to provide access for Georgian citizens to high-quality information. With regard to Azerbaijan, we have significant concerns, as pointed out in the Human Rights Report, regarding credible reports of significant human rights abuses, including torture and other physical abuses, political prisoners, and a lack of independent judiciary. Further, law enforcement officials arrested an unprecedented number of people for having alleged links to Iran. The United States promotes respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms when meeting with Azerbaijani officials at all levels, and through U.S. government statements at international organizations, and meetings with human rights advocates. For example, we continue to call publicly for the expeditious release of all unjustly detained political prisoners and detainees, including independent journalists, civil society activists, and government critics. We also employ social media. For example, the department's Without Just Cause campaign to release unjustly detained political prisoners, including an Azerbaijani individual, until he was released during the year. So this remains, of course, something that we're engaged on.
Okay, we'll take one more in the back. Yeah,
thank you very much for this opportunity. How do you describe human rights situation in Iran, especially in Kurdistan and Balochistan regions after Gina Amini's revolutions?
Okay, let's see. Well, thank you for your question. Well, I'll say it bluntly, Iran's dismal human rights record further deteriorated in 2023 as the regime increasingly targeted members of religious and ethnic minority groups, human rights lawyers, journalists, and civil society activists with intimidation, arrests, lengthy prison sentences, and used sexual violence and torture against prisoners and detainees. The Iranian regime, as I said earlier, expanded its discriminatory measures against women and increased its use of the death penalty, which was often applied after sham trials against defendants who lacked legal counsel. And this was disproportionately applied against members of the Baluchi and Kurdish ethnic minorities. The Iranian regime continued to project its repression abroad, intimidating, harassing, and silencing perceived dissidents beyond its border. The State Department used visa restrictions and economic sanctions to promote accountability for Iranian authorities' human rights violations since the most recent crackdown following the 2022 protests. We have taken action to restrict visas or impose sanctions on over 100 Iranian entities and individuals connected to human rights abuses, including the violent suppression of peaceful assembly. We provided support to help Iranians connect internet with anti-censorship tools. With 30 million Iranians used at the height, which they used this internet that we were able to help with, at the height of the 2022 protests. We issued General License D2, allowing U.S. companies to offer new internet services to Iranians. In the multilateral arena, the U.S. continued to support the fact-finding mission at the UN Human Rights Council that we helped stand up in November 2022. We were also instrumental in working with allies and partners to kick Iran off the UN Commission on the Status of Women. Regarding transnational repression, we worked across the U.S. government to share information and coordinate action, collaborated with like-minded governments and international organizations, conducted outreach to affected individuals and communities, and raised TNR in international fora. So I would say we've been quite engaged.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Okay, thank you.